profound internationalism permeates this whole October Revolution, in which the party struggled to transform the imperialist war into civil war into a world socialist revolution, is completely merged with the tempestuous momentum of the working masses of Russia and its great industrial centers. When Lenin and Trotsky defined the revolution in progress as a quote, link in this chain of the international revolution, the Russian masses who were defending the conquest of power by force of arms as a quote, detachment of the international army of the proletariat, and Russia as a besieged fortress waiting for the quote, other detachments of the international revolution to come to its aid, it was not only the militants of the party, but all the proletarians of Russia who felt the truth of these fiery words, because, quote, political education was carried out quickly. A few days, a few months, in factories and working class neighborhoods, in the midst of meetings and revolutionary demonstrations, in the proud preamble to the Declaration of the Rights of the Working and the Exploited People, January 1918, the Republic of the Soviets set itself the task of achieving, quote, the victory of socialism in all countries. And at the podium of the Third All-Russia Congress of Soviets, this was the grandiose perspective that Lenin proposed to his audience. Quote, things have turned out differently from what Marx and Engels expected, and we, the Russian working and exploited classes, have the honor of being the vanguard of the international socialist revolution. We can now see clearly how far the development of the revolution will go. The Russian began it, the German, the Frenchman, and the Englishman will finish it, and socialism will be victorious, unquote. It was much more than words. Shunning rhetoric, the revolution thus dryly expressed the feeling and the passion that armed the hands and mobilized the brains of immense proletarian masses. It was the impersonal language of a class struggle, which the combatants could never have admitted was simply Russian or narrowly national. With eyes open to the world and with a strong collective will, ready for any sacrifice, they knew no borders. Their hearts were inflamed at the news of the struggle of their class brothers beyond the borders that the revolution had rightly set out to break down. Quote, we are not alone. The whole of Europe is before us, unquote, cried Lenin to the hesitant, the conciliators, the cowards, and the proletarians who had fought ceaselessly for 9 tumultuous months, and who had still had to fight during the 2.5 years of the Civil War. They instinctively knew, like him, without perhaps ever having read the final words of the manifesto, that they were the fighters in an international class war. For these proletarians, it was obvious that their revolution was the beginning of a world revolution. In April, Lenin had said that the International of, quote, internationalists by deed was already at work, even though it did not yet have a formal existence. It was embodied in the proletarians of Petrograd, Moscow, as in Liebknecht and Berlin. It manifested itself in practical and active internationalism, in boundless devotion to the universal cause of socialism. During the dramatic episode in Brest-Litovsk, when the revolutionary cause might have seemed lost, Lenin justified the ignominious treaty with his usual courage and frankness, and commemorator gravediggers, he defined the, quote, need to solve international problems, the need to evoke a world revolution, to effect the transition from a strictly national revolution to the world revolution, unquote, as the, quote, greatest historical problem of the Russian Revolution, unquote, as, quote, the greatest difficulty that I had to overcome. Born as a global revolution, October put its international task to the fore, its duties toward the world revolution, duties not deriving from any moral code, but imposed by the international character of the emancipatory struggle of the proletariat and by capitalist expansion. Once again, many would be asked of those who had already given so much. The magnificent proletarians of October would not hesitate to give their best so that, quote, the Germans, the French, the English could complete the work that had begun. Because if it must be easier for them to complete it, quote, it is infinitely more difficult for them to start the revolution, unquote. Even before the communists of different countries of Europe, America, and Asia met in Moscow to establish the Third International, internationalism was the blood and oxygen nourishing the combatants in the giant civil war in Russia. The bulletins from the front of European class struggles mixed with the burning communiques that Trotsky sent from 1,000 fronts of the Civil War, and it was thus that the Russian workers and peasants in arms learned that their enemy was the international bourgeoisie. Quote, "You know," unquote, Lenin would say to the 8th All-Russia Congress of Soviets, quote, "to what extent capital is an international force, to what extent the most important capitalist factories, enterprises, and stores are linked together in the whole world, and that therefore, to bring it down definitively, joint action by workers is necessary on an international scale," unquote. No one, in truth, could have known this better than the heroic Russian detachment of the World Revolutionary Army of the Proletariat, because no one in its ranks believed that the clash between the classes could have different causes and outcomes in different nations. They each had learned through bitter experience that proletarians, quote, "have no country." Could men, the party, the proletarians for whom the Russian Revolution was a world revolution and had no, quote, "greater historical problem" than to leave its narrow national framework and spread throughout the whole world, have any other perspective than Lenin's? Quote, "Salvation lies only along that road of world socialist revolution upon which we can have set out. As long as we remain alone, our task is to save the revolution, to conserve within it a certain dose of socialism, however weak, until the revolution breaks out in other countries, and other detachments come to the rescue," unquote. Could they conceive of their revolution other than as a, quote, "general rehearsal for the world proletarian revolution," on which they were necessarily gambling, since, quote, "the communist revolution can only conquer as a world revolution," unquote. Certain of the outbreak of an at least European revolution, the Bolsheviks had secured a respite from the Brest-Litovsk peace and had defeated the White Hordes. Quote, "having gone from war to peace," unquote, in 1920, they did not forget that, quote, "as long as capitalism and socialism coexist, one cannot live in peace. In the end, one or the other must prevail. There will be a requiem mass for either the Soviet Republic or for world imperialism," unquote. They knew that to defeat the global organization of capitalism, there was only one weapon. Quote, "the extension of the revolution, at least to a few advanced countries," unquote. This was a vital condition even for the maintenance of political power by the Bolsheviks. But the October Revolution was aiming for socialism, and that is why internationalism was not a ritual formula, but the very condition for victory. This was all the more so since it was a double revolution, and the proletariat in power therefore had to fulfill the tasks of a bourgeois revolution, quote, "pushed it to its conclusion," unquote. In the manifesto of 1848, Marx and Engels gave particular attention to Germany. At the time, it was a country where feudal structures still dominated the economy and politics, and which was, quote, "on the eve of bourgeois revolution," unquote. In this revolution, they saw, quote, "the prelude to an immediately following, proletarian revolution, unquote, which was to take on European dimensions, where then could social democratic pedantry have discovered that for Marx and Engels, the revolution must necessarily break out in an advanced country, because they said this bourgeois revolution in Germany, quote, is bound to be carried out under more advanced conditions of European civilization, and with a much more developed proletariat than that of England was in the 17th and France in the 18th century, unquote. Let the opportunist Philistine measure the degree of maturity of the socialist revolution by assessing the quote, economic and social level unquote, reached in a country considered in isolation. For Marxism, this degree of maturity, and it is on the same scale that the proletarian revolution can triumph or perish. In Russia, likewise, the quote, more advanced conditions of European and world civilization, unquote, and the existence of a proletariat not only more numerous than at the time of the English and French bourgeois revolutions, but extremely concentrated, like that of the semi-feudal Tsarist regime, had accelerated the revolutionary course. Starting from quote, Asiatic and barbaric unquote, stagnation, it had ended in proletarian political power after a brief interlude of bourgeois power. The quote unquote immediate prelude had become quote unquote interpenetration from the bourgeois revolution to the proletarian revolution. The triumph of the second, rendering the accomplishment of the political tasks of the first anachronistic. Not only was this development insufficient to eliminate Russia's backwardness in a more advanced world civilization, but as Lenin said in 1918 and repeated in 1920, without precisely this backwardness, the proletariat would not have taken power as easily as, quote, lifting a feather, unquote. The happy meeting of these two conditions, which could only seem contradictory to those who limit their horizon to national borders, had put the Russian working class at the forefront of the world socialist revolution. But the backwardness remained, and the quote, more backward the country, which, owing to the zigzags of history, has proved to be the one to start the socialist revolution, the more difficult is it for that country to pass from the old capitalist relations to socialist relations, unquote. How was this historical problem more complex, the seizure of power, solved from the European, which at the time was effectively global, perspective of Marx and Engels? The German proletariat of 1848 would revive the doctrine and could become the protagonist of the double revolution in Germany, given that the political conditions for the socialist revolution had been fulfilled in France, and the economic and social conditions in England. In this way, the conquest of power in Germany could be accelerated, and the age-old gap between the economy of Central Europe and that of Western Europe could be bridged. The perspective was no different for the Bolsheviks. Socialism presupposes large-scale industry and modern agriculture. The first was manifestly insufficient in Russia, the second almost completely absent. But, quote, if we consider the problem on a world scale, we see that a flourishing large-scale industry capable of supplying the world with all kinds of goods exists. There are countries whose large-scale industry is so advanced that it could instantly satisfy the needs of hundreds of millions of backwards peasants. We make this the basis of our calculations, unquote. Thus, the proletarian dictatorship in Russia awaited the material conditions for the passage to socialism to arise from the global, or at least European revolution. Only in this way could the foundations be laid for a gigantic leap forward, first in industry, then in agriculture. As The thesis on the national and colonial question, adopted in 1920 at the Second Congress of the Communist International, stated, "This leap over the capitalist phase, envisaged in this case for the colonial countries, even more backward than Russia at the time, is only made possible by the creation of a world economy forming a single whole on the basis of a universal plan controlled by the proletariat of all nations." Unquote. The extension of the socialist revolution to at least a few advanced countries is therefore the first condition for the existence of a socialist economy in Russia. Quote, "There is no doubt that in a country where the overwhelming majority of the population consists of small agricultural producers, a socialist revolution can be carried out only through the implementation of a whole series of special transitional measures which would be superfluous in highly developed capitalist countries where wage workers in industry and agriculture make up the vast majority. We have stressed in a good many written works, in all our public utterances and all our statements in the press, that this is not the case in Russia. For here, industrial workers are a minority, and petty farmers are the vast majority. In such a country, the socialist revolution can triumph only on two conditions. First, if it is given timely support by a socialist revolution in one or several advanced countries." Unquote. Taking up the great perspective of Marx in 1848, we can say that the Russian proletariat passed the political torch to the European Revolution, together with a complete restoration of the doctrine. Germany, England, France, or even just one of them would have provided it with its economic base. Meanwhile, as the international revolution cannot break out on command or according to a quote-unquote methodical progression, or simultaneously, the communist power had to manage a still backward economy using quote transitional measures, completely useless in the countries of advanced capitalism, unquote, analogous in substance to the quote unquote despotic interventions recommended by the manifesto and whose results could not go beyond the construction of the material bases of socialism. Far from making a mystery of this, the Bolsheviks had said and repeated it, the April theses, declaring with the greatest frankness, quote, "It is not our immediate task to introduce socialism, but only to bring social production and the distribution of products at once under the control of the Soviet workers' deputies." Unquote. 5 months later, in September, Lenin defined the correct measures to quote combat the impending catastrophe, unquote, thus, quote, "The introduction of a proper distribution of labor power in the production and distribution of goods, husbanding of the people's forces, the elimination of all wasteful effort, economy of effort," unquote, which in the domain of the industrial production and its financial machinery assumed the quote amalgamation of all banks into a single bank, nationalization of the syndicates, in other words, the largest monopolistic capitalist associations, the abolition of commercial secrecy, compulsory syndication, compulsory organization of the population into consumer societies, or encouragement of such organization, and the exercise of control over it, unquote. But he also explained that these measures, which only the dictatorial power of the workers and poor peasants could apply, would represent, quote, "a step towards socialism, for socialism is merely the next step forward from state capitalist monopoly," unquote. The imperialist war marks the eve of the socialist revolution. And this is not only because the horrors of the war gave rise to the proletarian revolt. No revolt can bring about socialism unless the economic conditions for socialism are ripe, but because state monopoly capitalism is a complete material preparation for socialism. The threshold of socialism, a rung on the ladder of history, between which and the rung called socialism, there are no intermediate rungs, unquote. Anxious to find a left cover for their class collaboration, the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries cried out that this program was too timid, that it was not socialist, without understanding that it was only a question of advancing towards socialism, quote, taking steps toward it, steps conditioned and determined by the level of technology and culture, unquote. Socialism, moreover, quote, now gazing at us from all the windows of modern capitalism, unquote, appearing, quote, directly, practically by every important measure that constitutes a forward step on the basis of this modern capitalism, unquote. The Bolshevik program was timid compared to the ultimate goals of socialism, but audacious if we consider the level reached by, quote, technology and culture, unquote, simultaneously backward and advanced, so much so that without a world socialist revolution to bridge the gap between its aspirations and its possibilities, socialism was not possible in Russia. Quote, we do not know and we cannot know how many stages of transition to socialism there will be. That depends on when the full-scale European socialist revolution begins. Unquote. The question of the stages toward socialism was therefore not an administrative one, but political, and depending on international conditions, it could not be decided at will by Russian revolutionaries. With regard to agriculture, did the measures constantly advocated by the Bolsheviks from 1906 to 1917, even more radical if one takes into account this extremely low degree of development of the agrarian productive forces, go beyond the limits of a democratic bourgeois revolution? Of course, only a revolutionary power in the hands of the proletariat and supported by the poor peasants could nationalize the land, but this nationalization was nonetheless a bourgeois measure. However, the proletarian party should strive to achieve it by all means, because it, quote, implies freedom for the class struggle and freedom of land tenure from all non-bourgeois adjuncts to the greatest possible degree conceivable in a capitalist society, unquote. Moreover, it must, quote, in effect, deal such a powerful blow to private ownership of all the means of production in general that the party of the proletariat must facilitate such a reform in every way possible. What's more, the party knew since 1906 at the latest that, quote, the more determined and consistent the breakup and elimination of the landed estates, and the more determined and consistent the bourgeois democratic agrarian reform in Russia in general, the more vigorous and speedier will be the development of the class struggle of the agricultural proletariat against the well-to-do peasant, or the peasant bourgeoisie, unquote. Consequently, quote, the fate and the outcome of the Russian Revolution, unless the incipient proletarian revolution in Europe exercises a direct and powerful influence on our country, will depend on whether the urban proletariat succeeds in rallying the rural proletariat together with the mass of rural semi-proletarians behind it, or whether this mass follows the lead of the peasant bourgeoisie, which is gravitating toward an alliance with the capitalists and landowners, and towards the counter-revolution in general, unquote. Prophetic words. The European Revolution would indeed take a long time to come, and if its upheavals in Germany, Bavaria, Hungary, its surges in Italy or Bulgaria would be enough to loosen the grip of the foreign counter-revolution threatening the Bolshevik dictatorship, they would not be enough to wrest Russia from its barbaric isolation. The entire fate of the October Revolution after 1918, when Lenin was already outlining the future NEP, still impracticable because of the Civil War, depended upon the facts in answer to this question. Quote, shall we be able to hold on with our small and very small peasant rural production, and in our present state of ruin, until the West European capitalist countries consummate their development towards socialism, we too lack enough civilization to enable us to pass straight on to socialism. Although we do have the political requisites for it, we should adopt the following tactics or pursue the following policy to save ourselves. Unquote. The complete nationalization of industry, imposed in 1918 by the necessities of the Civil War, and the monopoly of foreign trade would give the proletarian dictatorship an advantage that was more political than economic, a means of controlling the constantly reviving hydra of microproduction, an instrument to accelerate, by modern means of production, the evolution towards large-scale agricultural production using associated labor, and above all, a weapon against the external and especially the internal enemy. It would thus be possible to quote-unquote use capitalism, especially by orienting it along the path of state capitalism, as an intermediate link between small production and socialism, as a means, a path, a process, a modality ensuring the increase of the productive forces and, quote, to achieve the transition in a series of gradual stages to large-scale socialized mechanized agriculture, unquote. It would be possible to lay, quote, the economic foundations for the new socialist edifice on the site of the demolished feudal edifice and the semi-demolished capitalist edifice, unquote. This was not to achieve socialism, but was a radical struggle between the proletarian power controlling state capitalism and using it as a political weapon of economic transformation, and, quote, the millions upon millions of petty proprietors who, through their ordinary, everyday, imperceptible, elusive, and demoralizing activities, produce the very results which the bourgeoisie needs, and which tend to restore the bourgeoisie, unquote. This was to be the continuation of the Civil War by other means. And the outcome of this new phase of the class struggle was bound to depend not only on the possession of power and control over the large-scale industries, but also, and above all, on the vicissitudes of the international struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. In his theses on the economic situation of Soviet Russia from the standpoint of the Socialist Revolution, presented at the Fourth Congress of the Communist International, Trotsky would say, quote, just as the contest in the Civil War involved in the main which side would succeed in attracting the peasantry politically, so today the struggle revolves chiefly around the peasant market. In this struggle, the proletariat has mighty advantages on its side. The country's most highly developed productive forces and state power. On the side of the bourgeoisie lies the advantage of greater proficiency and, to a certain extent, of connections with foreign capital, particularly that of the white guard emigres, unquote. The fact that the proletariat of the so-called more advanced countries did not stand up with arms in hand against this international bourgeois force is the tragedy of the years 1920 to 26. In defining the NEP, Lenin had declared, quote, history has taken such a peculiar course that it has given birth in 1918 to two unconnected halves of socialism existing side by side, like two future chickens in the single shell of international imperialism. In 1918, Germany and Russia have become the most striking embodiment of the material realization of the economic, the productive, and the socio-economic conditions for socialism on the one hand, and the political conditions on the other. A successful proletarian revolution in Germany would immediately and very easily smash any shell of imperialism, and would bring about the victory of world socialism for certain, and therefore equally the victory of socialism in Russia. Editor's note. without any difficulty or with slight difficulty. Of course, by difficulty we mean difficult on a world historical scale and not in the parochial Philistine sense." Unquote. The two separate halves of socialism could not be united. And if the Russian revolutionary power could take German state capitalism as its model, apply itself with all it might to assimilate it, not sparing dictatorial procedures, to implant it in Russia even faster than Peter the Great implanted Western customs in the barbaric old Russia, without shrinking from the use of barbaric methods against barbarism, open parenthesis, quite another thing, as is clear from the, quote, "construction of socialism in one country," unquote, which is the more barbarian, close parenthesis. It could not prevent, deprived as it was of the help of the second chicken, the pressure of the petty bourgeois and bourgeois classes from forcing the steering wheel of the Russian state in the opposite direction to that which the Bolsheviks had intended. The struggle resumed in the cities and the countryside. The productive forces of a past that was not merely pre-socialist but pre-capitalist reared up under the grip of the central leadership of the economy. And this new class war was so bitter that at the 14th Party Conference at the end of 1925, some leaders of the party and the state, who until then had thought they could hide reality behind a demagogic optimism totally foreign to Lenin, were forced to recognize that a reversal of the balance of forces was underway and was confirmed within the country. In 1921, with regard to the NEP, Lenin had said, quote, "10 or 20 years of regular relations with the peasantry and victory is also assured on a world scale, even if there is delay in the proletarian revolutions which are maturing. Otherwise, 20 to 40 years of tormenting, white guard terror," unquote. The White Terror started long before Lenin's 10 or 20 years, or the 50 years of which Trotsky spoke, because the forces opposing the establishment of so-called rational relations with the peasantry were too powerful for it to be possible to contain them, and ultimately to defeat them, with the sole resources of the Russian proletariat. And it was the Stalinist counter-revolution whose cult of fake quote-unquote socialism in one country barely covered the cruel reality, forced capitalist accumulation and massacre of the Bolshevik old guard. The story of Lenin's long struggle on his deathbed to convince the party of the need to pass under the caudine forks of the NEP while remaining fully aware of what it meant to build capitalism, this struggle to safeguard the rigorously classist and internationalist character of the party was all the more necessary as the dangers presented by the NEP were greater. This story alone deserves a separate chapter and will no doubt be the subject of a collective study by the party. The same goes for the history of the oppositions. As Lenin's intransigence was diluted, they fought an energetic, though late and desperate battle against Stalinism, against its political abdication before opportunism, and its nefarious theory of so-called socialism in one country, to safeguard the doctrine whose keystone is precisely proletarian internationalism, as demonstrated a contrario by the tragic denouement of October, and for its transmission to future generations. Lenin was too good a Marxist to ignore the fact that even defeat can be fruitful, proving you have fought to the end without yielding and are still on your feet. And that is why he once exclaimed at a teachers' conference in May 1919, quote, "Even if the imperialists should overthrow the Bolshevik power tomorrow, we would not regret for 1 second that we took power," unquote. Was the final outcome avoidable? Was it possible to prevent Bolshevik power from being controlled and even overthrown by capitalism, instead of controlling it as it had courageously set out to do while waiting for the world revolution? Or to prevent the bourgeois and petty bourgeois forces within from gradually taking over the state machine, which, contrary to Lenin's supposition on the above quotation, the imperialists had failed to overturn? To avoid not simply the enemy's triumph, but worse still, to stop it from passing off primitive capitalist accumulation, which Russia's delayed entry onto the stage of world civilization made 1,000 times harsher than it would have been at the dawn of capitalism, as quote unquote building socialism? This is an idle question in many respects, since history has decided against us time and time again, whether we like it or not. However, it deserves to be asked, if it is not just to moan about the past, but rather to prepare for the future. This must be done by looking at things internationally and looking for the answer outside of Russia's borders. In 1926 to 27, in the debates of the Russian Party and the 7th and 8th enlarged plenums of the Executive Committee of the Communist International, ECCI, devoted to the economic and social questions of Russia, the opposition spoke on behalf of a working class that had been decimated and exhausted by the Civil War, hunger, and economic reconstruction, despite its exemplary fighting spirit. The tragedy of the opposition is no doubt due to the fact that the development and victory of capitalism in Russia had unleashed a social wave that irresistibly brought forward the official leadership of the party, which it was trying to fight. But this tragedy is mainly due to the fact that the Russian opposition could not rely on an international communist movement worthy of its origins, to say nothing of the general ebb of the revolution itself. October has drawn most of its strength from an international source, but by 1926 to 27, the source had dried up, and the Russian opposition was alone. At the Fifth Congress of the Communist International, the Communist left had courageously called on the international communist movement to give back to the party and Bolshevik power some of the tremendous theoretical and practical contribution they had brought to it a few years earlier, but the call had fallen into the void. At the Sixth Enlarged ECCI, at the beginning of 1926, the same communist left showed that there was an urgent need to overturn the quote-unquote pyramid of the International, which was unbalanced at its summit, since it rested on a Bolshevik party that had lost its homogeneity, and to put the pyramid on a more stable base, that is to say, on a world communist movement aware of its duties. Unfortunately, this base was already cracked too. The left also asked the world movement to take up the quote-unquote Russian question and discuss it as a critical issue, since this was of international import, but the International abdicated, no force capable of fulfilling this duty having had the courage to respond to the call. Delegates to the International in Moscow were now only Social Democrats, Mensheviks, and centrists. In short, all the political dregs that had found a niche in the various quote-unquote national parties, and now felt that their time had come again. The Kashins, the Samards, the Smerals, the Talmans, and the Martinovs, behind whom were hiding very specific social forces and political traditions, only wanted to become Stalin's corporals after having been the obtuse executioners of the communists of the opposition. The heroic struggle of the Chinese proletarians and the English miners in the same years could only be in vain without a vanguard to guide the struggle, since their party had been submerged under this social democratic detritus. This terrible quote-unquote historical vacuum is no doubt something that itself must be explained, but it is this vacuum that explains the defeat and the human tragedy of the old guard, from which Trotsky was the only one to escape, who bowed down to Stalin and his victorious clique as it trampled over the corpses of activists who had given their all to the cause, and even the political zombies who fully recanted. It would be childish and above all anti-Marxist to invoke a single factor to explain the appalling decadence of the international communist movement. But it would be just as childish and even worse, defeatist to attribute everything to objective facts, as if they constituted an inevitability to which, like the ancients, one should resign oneself and not bring forward the subjective factor, which is the party, and in this case the World Party, the Communist International, which is the source of decisive lessons. On this level, we, the communist left, have the right to say that the lesson we draw from the rout of 1926, the point of departure for the most terrible counter-revolution of which the working class has ever been a victim, is not an a posteriori lesson, but the confirmation of the forecasts we made in 1920, a confirmation that is valid for all the countries and all the situations, and from which the future proletarian revolution will profit. If the Western communists saw in Bolshevism a prestigious master, in whom they recognized the right to give lessons, this is due to the fact that it had obstinately advocated theoretical intransigence, and showed itself capable of translating it into action. It never hesitated to sever its links irrevocably, not only with right-wing revisionism, but also with centrist revisionism, more subtle and therefore more pernicious. Having identified the social and political origins of both, it knew in advance that they would be on the other side of the class barricade. This is due to the fact that it had obstinately advocated theoretical intransigence and shown itself capable of translating it into action. It never hesitated to sever its links irrevocably, not only with right-wing revisionism, but also with centrist revisionism, more subtle and therefore more pernicious. Having identified the social and political origins of both, it knew in advance that they would be on the other side of the class barricade. This was proved by the demarcation between the Leninist left and the pacifist left in Zimmerwald, the April theses, and the impression they made on the party. It was from this that October drew strength to liquidate the last alliances with other groups or parties, to exercise dictatorship and red terror, to wage civil war. This is the main lesson that the communists and revolutionary proletarians of the whole world should have drawn from the Russian Revolution. The Hungarian debacle, the first negative lesson of the post-war period, having sufficiently demonstrated what price we had to pay when we forgot it, and the Communist International having made it a duty for communists to observe in its 21 conditions of admission. The Bolsheviks were the first to forget this lesson when they lost sight of the fact that it was even more valid in the West than in Russia. In the West, the economic structure was that of developed capitalism, but a century of government experience had allowed the bourgeoisie to establish its parliamentary democracy on firm foundations. As Lenin repeated 100 times, these political conditions made it more difficult to start the revolution, whereas the economic and social conditions would, on the contrary, have made it easy to drive it to its conclusion. Theoretical and organizational intransigence, the sectarian courage to separate organically from dubious elements, even tinged with maximalism, Awareness of the irrevocable character of the boundaries drawn by history between communism and all the variants of opportunism, starting with centrism, should have exercised its strength to the maximum in the global political organization of the revolutionary proletariat. But it was not so. At the Second Congress of the International, the Communist left showed that the lack of severity of the conditions of admission risked allowing opportunism, which had been driven out the door, to return through the window. It deeply regretted that the theoretical and programmatic bases of the international movement had not been clearly and precisely defined from the start, in order to deduce from these tactical rules that were just as clear and precise, were just as mandatory. Its long experience enabled it to highlight the dissolving effects of electoral and parliamentary practices on Western parties, and it therefore proposed a tactic of electoral abstention, which had nothing in common with anarchist, syndicalist, or other positions. Instead of the tactics of quote-unquote revolutionary parliamentarianism that of the majority of the Third International wanted to apply, it proposed that the splits should take place as much as possible on the left, not out of theoretical luxury or out of party hatred, but for eminently practical reasons, or if you like, out of class hatred. Finally, it demanded that membership of the Communist Party of each country, but it would have preferred that there be a world party, unique in its program, its doctrine, and the anticipated definition of its tactics and organization, should be on an individual and never on a collective basis. From that moment, it did not hesitate to insist on the danger of a right-wing degeneration. The Bolsheviks preferred, but again, what was apart from that of the Communist left, the international movement's contribution to the defense of the Bolshevik tradition, against central Moscow if necessary, to adopt an elastic and easier method, placing their hopes with Lenin and Trotsky in the purifying flames of a European revolution deemed to be close at hand. And in the firmness of an international leadership, with a long tradition of theoretical and practical intransigence. Then, finally, with Lenin dead and Trotsky reduced to silence, in the self-immunization of the party guide against any opportunistic poison, it was believed in good faith, but that is another story, that substantial results could be achieved faster and by the shortest route, by blurring the political boundaries which for militants, but especially for the great mass of proletarians, needed on the contrary to remain clear and definitive. This was the tactic of the quote-unquote political united front, launched at the third, fourth, and fifth congresses, and the corresponding enlarged ECCIs, which is the Executive Committee of the Communist International, and which our current was alone in contesting. There were also infiltrations by and mergers with fractions of centrist parties, or even almost entire parties. It was then necessary to soften the slogan of dictatorship of the proletariat, which was diluted with the equivocal demand for workers' government, then workers' and peasants' government. It thus became the slogan of conquest of the majority of the working class, which for Lenin meant conquest of the greatest possible influence, and was therefore self-evident, but which would become, for his poor imitators, the ideal of numerical majority, and in all circumstances the criterion for judging the party's revolutionary efficiency. They did not understand or did not want to understand, in spite of the best Bolshevik tradition, that if the party is a factor in history, it is also its product, and that the tactic it employs is not irrelevant, that on the contrary, it is an action that provokes a reaction in whoever uses it, and sets in motion objective forces which, depending on the direction which is given to it, can obstruct the road towards the revolution instead of clearing it. They forgot that a slogan, from the moment it is launched, becomes an objective fact that determines the party itself. Whatever its intentions, and however skillful he is, the apprentice sorcerer cannot control the demons he has unleashed. The history of the Communist International is the history of the destructive attrition that the tactical instrument and the organizational instrument, arbitrarily detached from principles, exert on those who employ them under such conditions. The errors of organization, then of tactics, finally led, and inexorably, this is what we must understand, to a revision of the theoretical principles and the program. The opportunism driven out through the door could return through the window in the name of Bolshevization by decree. When we were fighting against these successive missteps, we never claimed to offer the International an infallible recipe for victory. It was only a question of preventing social democratic infection, of protecting the party, large or small, within the limits that history allowed, to help it keep its own physiognomy intact through the vicissitudes of the class struggle. That is to say, its capacity to orient the proletarian masses in a determined direction, and only in that direction, to shut the door automatically on revisionist defectors, their ideology as well as their practice, to make the International truly and no longer only formally the single world party of the revolution, and to allow it, if necessary, to safeguard in defeat, which nothing and no one can prevent, the conditions for recovery, instead of losing everything. But on the contrary, all was lost. In 1926 to 27, the opposition found itself alone facing the enemy that it had unconsciously helped to install within the movement. It remained a prisoner of the forces against which it had not thought it useful to build an effective defense. It had to fight, in the party, against the worst agents of reformist conformism, who should never have been allowed to enter it. The opposition was not supported by an international movement capable of standing up as one man against the renunciation of all principles, because it was no longer as one, and no longer even itself. This in no way diminishes the greatness of a Trotsky, loftily hailing internationalism against what he called the Monroe Doctrine of Stalin's, and alas, Bukharin's, international, nor the greatness of a Zinoviev, who, at the fourth enlarged ECCI, dug his own grave by demonstrating that, quote, socialism in one country, unquote, was the negation of all Marxism, and therefore also of Leninism. But that was not enough. It was necessary to renounce elastic tactics and organizational methods, but it was already too late to do so, and it was not they who were able to do so. Let us, in the dark tunnel of a counter-revolution, whose end we can only still imagine, turn our eyes to the past for the sole purpose of finding the road to the future. All this is part of the lessons of October. Events could not have happened otherwise, but the past has forged in with the form of historical lessons the only weapons capable, within the limits where the subjective factor, the action of the party is decisive, of preventing the class which holds the keys to the future from repeating its own errors, its own oscillations, its own uncertainties, by once again opening to it the unique path of revolution, which can be temporarily blocked by setbacks and defeats, but which the proletariat will inevitably have to clear away, even if, as the case is today, it needs to start from scratch. The counter-revolution was able to crush October, but it could not and will never be able to prevent capitalism from accumulating the explosive charges of a revolutionary renaissance, more powerful than ever. Historical development reduces the national peculiarities that have nourished Stalinism to a crude cardboard cutout, which cannot disguise the profound oneness of the world. In this world, the proletarian revolution, the only one possible in contemporary times, is objectively on the agenda of all the key countries on the world capitalist system. It is on this material basis, this granite foundation, and armed with the teachings of defeat as well as with the victory of October, fortified by the confirmation of Marxism through the events of 1926 and the tactical and organizational theses of the communist left, that from a tragic debacle the class revolutionary party can be reborn on a world scale. That's the end of section 1. I was wrong earlier in saying that there weren't really sections. They just are massive. There's a bunch of notes here going over all the, footnotes. It's a very well constructed text. I will get ready and start working on part 2. But that's a much larger part, and it's about the false lessons about the counter-revolution. So, thanks for listening.